Captain Emma Roberts, returning from a challenging 6-month deployment in Iraq, navigates the bustling airport terminal with a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. Her heart feels heavy with memories of her service, yet a small smile graces her face at the thought of reuniting with her family. The emotional weight of the journey is softened by the promise of finally returning home to those she loves. As the boarding announcement for her flight to Chicago echoed through the terminal, Emma Roberts glanced at her ticket again, puzzled by what she saw. A first-class seat? She frowned slightly, double-checking to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. Indeed, her ticket clearly read Seat 6A, First Class. Whether it was an unexpected upgrade or a rare stroke of luck, Emma decided not to question it. After months of grueling military transport flights, the idea of traveling in comfort felt almost surreal. Making her way down the jet bridge, the distinct sound of her boots echoed softly. Stepping onto the plane, she was greeted warmly by a flight attendant who directed her to her plush seat. Emma settled in, letting out a soft sigh of relief, grateful for this small moment of peace. As Emma Roberts settled into her first-class seat, savoring the rare comfort, a sharp voice abruptly shattered her moment of peace. "Excuse me," a man in his 50s said, standing in the aisle with a look of irritation. "I believe you're in my seat." Emma glanced up, startled, and met his disapproving gaze, which lingered on her military uniform. Calmly, she replied, "This is my assigned seat," showing him her ticket to confirm. The man's expression hardened as he scanned the ticket, his tone growing more accusatory. "There must be some mistake. This is first class." His implication was clear, and Emma felt the familiar sting of judgment, a prejudice she had faced before. Just as the tension mounted, a flight attendant approached. After reviewing Emma's ticket, she firmly reassured the man that her assignment to first class was accurate, leaving him to huff off to his seat in frustration. As the confrontation continued, Emma Roberts held her ground, her calm demeanor masking the unease she felt inside. The man insisted, his voice rising. "This has to be a mistake. She can't possibly have a first-class ticket." Before Emma could respond, a flight attendant arrived, her professional smile unwavering, but her eyes sharp with authority. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her gaze shifting between the man and Emma. The man immediately launched into his complaint. "This woman claims she has a first-class ticket, but I doubt that's accurate. There's clearly been a mix-up." The flight attendant maintained her composure, taking Emma's boarding pass and examining it. After a brief moment, she handed it back with a polite but firm response. "Everything appears to be in order, sir. Captain Roberts is indeed assigned to seat 6A. The man's face flushed with frustration and embarrassment. "This is unacceptable," he muttered. "I paid good money for this ticket, and now—" "Sir," the flight attendant interjected, her voice firm, "Captain Roberts has a valid ticket and every right to sit here. If you cannot lower your voice and find your assigned seat, I will be forced to involve security." With a final glare at Emma, the man stomped off, leaving the tension in the air to slowly dissipate. As the man stormed off, Emma Roberts took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. She had faced intense situations on the battlefield, but the sting of prejudice and judgment always cut in a different, more personal way. She could feel the weight of the other passengers' eyes on her, a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Turning toward the window, she sought solace in the clouds outside, trying to find peace amidst the turbulence of her thoughts. Instead of dwelling on the anger and sadness, Emma reached for her backpack and pulled out a small notebook and pen. Writing had always been a way for her to process her emotions, and this moment felt like it needed more than silence. She began to write, her pen moving deliberately across the page. "Dear Sir," she started, pausing to gather her thoughts. This wasn't about confronting him with anger or calling out his behavior. It was about bridging the gap of misunderstanding. Emma knew that prejudice often came from ignorance, and perhaps if she shared a piece of her story, it might shift his perspective. She wrote about her service, the camaraderie she built with soldiers from all backgrounds, and the sacrifices they all made for the same cause. She described the 6 months she'd spent in Iraq, navigating harrowing conditions and enduring long separations from her family. Emma highlighted the importance of her uniform, not as a representation of her alone, but as a symbol of countless individuals who had dedicated their lives to serving their country. She reflected on the diversity in her unit and the strength they drew from their differences, a lesson that had shaped her deeply. "This letter isn't to reprimand or scold," she wrote, "but to offer understanding. I hope it will help you see me and others in uniform not through the lens of assumption, but with an open mind." Emma paused for a moment, rereading her words. She wanted to ensure the tone was hopeful, not accusatory. This wasn't about fueling more division, but about extending an olive branch. As she continued to write, her resolve strengthened. She would finish this letter before the plane landed and, if she had the courage, hand it to the man. The act of writing soothed her spirit, transforming a moment of conflict into an opportunity for connection. Emma didn't know how the man would react, but she hoped her words might plant a seed for change. As the plane hit a patch of turbulence, the cabin jolted, and a low murmur of unease rippled through the passengers. Emma Roberts instinctively gripped the armrests, but remained composed, her military training kicking in. Across the aisle, she noticed an elderly woman clutching her seat tightly, her face pale with fear. Emma leaned over, her voice calm and steady. "It's okay, ma'am," she said reassuringly. "This kind of turbulence is normal. Just take deep breaths, it'll pass soon." The woman looked at Emma, her wide eyes softening slightly at the sound of her soothing tone. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. Emma gave her a warm smile and nodded. "I've flown through much rougher skies. You're in good hands." Her quiet confidence seemed to ease not only the elderly woman, but also the passengers nearby, who exchanged relieved glances. Emma's empathy turned a tense moment into one of calm reassurance. As the plane steadied and the turbulence subsided, Emma Roberts leaned back in her seat, her pen hovering over the notebook in her lap. She stared at the partially written letter, her mind drifting to her time in Iraq and the extraordinary people she had served alongside. Memories flooded back, some painful, others heartwarming. She realized that these moments, this sense of shared humanity, were what she wanted to convey in her letter. Her thoughts turned to her unit, a group as diverse as the country they served. There was Maria, a sharp-witted medic from Texas who had become Emma's closest friend. Emma remembered Maria's quick thinking and steady hands during an ambush that had saved lives, including Emma's. Then there was Ahmed, their interpreter, a brave and selfless man who had risked everything to help their mission succeed. His laughter had been a rare source of levity in the most harrowing moments. Emma also thought of Trevor, a young soldier from rural Kentucky, whose love for storytelling had brought their group together during quiet nights at the base. Their bond transcended race, religion, and background. In the field, those differences didn't matter. What mattered was trust, courage, and a shared goal. They had become a family, united by a commitment to protect one another and fulfilled their mission. She began to write again, her words flowing with purpose. "Dear sir," she continued, "I want to share with you a piece of my story, not to change your mind immediately, but to offer a different perspective. My uniform may seem like just a symbol to you, but to me, it represents the sacrifices, courage, and unity of the men and women I served with." Emma described her first day in basic training, standing alongside recruits from every corner of America. She wrote about the bonds they formed, the challenges they overcame together, and the deep respect they developed for one another despite their differences. She reflected on missions where they relied on each other without hesitation, knowing that their survival depended on trust. I have learned, she wrote, that strength comes not from similarity but from diversity. In the heat of battle, we didn't see race, gender, or background. We saw teammates, people who would lay down their lives for one another. She paused, thinking of how best to address the man's prejudice without confrontation. I don't know what shaped your assumptions, she added gently, but I hope you can consider that the uniform I wear represents not just me, but thousands of others who have fought for the freedoms we all enjoy, freedoms that include the right to question and challenge. Emma's pen moved swiftly as she recounted the pride she felt in her service, not for personal glory, but for being part of something larger than herself. She wrote about the children they had helped in Iraq, the schools they had protected, and the communities they had supported in their fight for a better future. Her words softened as she closed her letter. This letter isn't meant to accuse or judge. It's an invitation to see, to understand, and to bridge the gap between us. Because I believe that when we take the time to know each other, we find more in common than we expect. As she reread what she had written, Emma felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just a response to the man's behavior. It was a step toward building understanding in a world that often felt divided. She folded the letter carefully, knowing that handing it to him might not change everything, but it could be a start. And sometimes, starting the conversation was enough to make a difference. As the plane taxied to the gate, Emma Roberts took a deep breath, clutching the letter she had poured her heart into. The envelope felt heavier than it should, its contents holding a mixture of her experiences, hopes, and the courage it took to face prejudice with understanding. Gathering her resolve, she stood and approached the man who had confronted her earlier. He was pulling his carry-on from the overhead bin when he noticed her. "Excuse me, sir," Emma said, her voice calm but steady. He turned, his expression wary, as if bracing for another confrontation. "I wanted to give you this," she said, holding out the envelope. The man hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. "What is it?" he asked gruffly. "It's a letter," Emma explained. "I wrote it to share a bit of my story. You don't have to read it now, but I hope you'll take a moment to later." The man stared at the envelope for a moment before taking it slowly. "Thank you," he muttered, his tone softer than before. Emma nodded, offering him a small, reassuring smile before returning to her seat. Later, as passengers began to disembark, the man approached Emma. His demeanor had shifted, the earlier hostility replaced with a mixture of shame and regret. "Captain Roberts," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. My behavior earlier was unacceptable." Emma met his eyes, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you," she said simply, sensing there was more he wanted to say. The man took a deep breath, his voice thick with emotion. "I lost my brother in Afghanistan 2 years ago. He was a soldier too." Emma felt a wave of understanding wash over her. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she replied, her tone gentle. In that moment, they shared a connection, a silent acknowledgement of sacrifice, grief, and the power of empathy. After disembarking, Emma Roberts was collecting her thoughts when she heard a voice call her name. She turned to see the man from the plane, David, as he introduced himself, hurrying toward her. His demeanor was different now, no longer defensive but reflective, even hesitant. He clutched the letter she had given him, the folded paper slightly wrinkled as if he had read it more than once. "Captain Roberts," he began, his voice subdued. I read your letter while we were landing. I wasn't expecting it to hit me the way it did." He paused, searching for the right words. "I wanted to say thank you, and I'm sorry." Emma studied him for a moment, noting the genuine remorse in his eyes. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "It means a lot to hear." David glanced down at the letter in his hands, then back at her. Your words, they really made me think. I've been carrying around a lot of anger since my brother Jack was killed in Afghanistan 2 years ago. I think I've been directing that anger at all the wrong places, including people like you. Jack would have hated that. He believed in people no matter where they came from. Emma nodded, her expression softening. Grief can make us react in ways we don't expect. It's not easy to face those feelings, let alone acknowledge them. David looked away, his brow furrowed. I was so quick to judge you. The uniform, the seat, it all stirred something in me that I hadn't dealt with. But reading your letter, hearing about your experiences, it made me realize how unfair I was, and how much Jack would have been disappointed in me for it. Emma smiled gently. I wrote the letter, not to blame you, but to offer perspective. We've all faced loss and hardship in different ways, and I believe understanding can help bridge those divides. David nodded, visibly moved. I'd like to buy you a coffee, if you have time. I feel like I have a lot to learn, and I'd appreciate the chance to hear more of your story. Emma hesitated for a moment, glancing at her watch. Her family wouldn't arrive at the airport for another hour, and the sincerity in David's tone made her decision easy. All right, she said with a small smile. I have some time. The two made their way to a nearby coffee shop, settling at a small table in the corner. The bustling noise of the terminal faded into the background as David broke the silence. Your letter, it wasn't just about you, was it? It was about all the people you've served with, too. Emma nodded, her gaze steady. That's right. My uniform represents more than just me. It represents my unit, the sacrifices we've made, and the values we stand for. The people I served with came from all walks of life, but out there, none of that mattered. We were family. She pulled out her phone and showed David a picture of her unit. It was a dusty snapshot of smiling faces, men and women of different races, backgrounds, and religions, standing shoulder to shoulder. This is my unit, she explained. The woman next to me is Maria. She saved my life during an ambush. And the man on the far right is Ahmed, our interpreter. He risked everything to help us. These people, they're more than teammates. They're my family. David studied the photo, his expression thoughtful. Jack used to say the same thing in his letters. He talked about how close he was to his unit, how they looked out for each other. I guess I didn't really understand what he meant until now. Emma leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but warm. That bond is what makes the military special. It's not about who you are or where you're from. It's about what you're willing to do for each other. I wanted to share that with you because I believe it's something we can all learn from, whether we wear a uniform or not. David's eyes filled with emotion as he absorbed her words. I've spent the last 2 years angry at the world, he admitted, his voice thick. I blamed everyone for Jack's death, but I never stopped to think about what he stood for. He believed in equality, in judging people by their actions, not their appearance. Your letter reminded me of that. Emma offered him a reassuring smile. It's not easy to confront our biases or the pain that shapes them, but you're doing that now, and that's what matters. They talked for nearly an hour, sharing stories and reflecting on their experiences. Emma recounted moments from her deployment, the challenges, the camaraderie, and the small acts of kindness that reminded her of humanity even in the darkest times. David in turn shared memories of his brother, painting a picture of a man who had inspired him to be better, even in death. As their conversation drew to a close, David reached into his pocket and handed Emma a business card. I run a veteran support group, he explained. We help soldiers adjust to civilian life. I'd be honored if you'd consider joining us. I think you could make a real difference. Emma accepted the card, her smile growing. Thank you, David. I'd like that. They stood, and David extended his hand. Captain Roberts, thank you for your service, for your letter, and for this conversation. It's opened my eyes in ways I didn't think possible. Emma shook his hand firmly. Thank you for listening, and for being willing to grow. That takes courage. As they parted ways, Emma felt a profound sense of hope. What had started as a moment of conflict had transformed into an opportunity for connection and understanding. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts, like writing a letter, could lead to meaningful change. Stepping off the plane and into the terminal, Emma Roberts felt a wave of relief wash over her. The journey home, both physical and emotional, had been a roller coaster. As she scanned the bustling crowd in the arrivals area, her heart quickened, knowing her family was waiting just beyond the barrier. Her duffel bag, worn and heavy from 6 months of deployment, hung on her shoulder like a symbol of the experiences she carried with her. Then she saw them. A vibrant, hand-painted banner that read, "Welcome home, Emma," hung in the air, flanked by balloons in red, white, and blue. Her father, tall and sturdy, held one end of the sign while her younger brother, Tyler, waved enthusiastically from the other. Her mother stood in the middle, already wiping tears from her eyes as she spotted Emma. Emma quickened her steps, the weight of the past 6 months momentarily lifting as she closed the distance between them. Her mother reached her first, wrapping her in a warm, tearful embrace. "Oh, honey, you're finally home," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Emma held her tightly, savoring the familiar scent of her mother's perfume and the comfort of her touch. "I missed you so much, Mom," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. Her father was next, pulling her into a strong hug that conveyed more than words ever could. "Welcome home, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady but filled with pride. "We've missed you more than you can imagine." "I missed you too, Dad," Emma replied, her heart swelling with gratitude. Tyler, usually too cool for displays of affection, surprised her by throwing his arms around her waist. "You're back," he exclaimed, his face alight with excitement. "It's so boring without you." Emma laughed, ruffling his hair. "I missed you too, Squirt. Have you been taking care of Mom and Dad for me?" "Sort of," Tyler admitted, grinning, "but I'm better at video games now." The family's laughter mingled with the buzz of the terminal as they all gathered around her, each trying to talk at once. Questions tumbled out. How was the flight? Did she eat? Was she exhausted? Emma answered as best she could, overwhelmed but deeply comforted by their presence. As they walked toward the baggage claim, Emma glanced around at the familiar chaos of the airport. It felt surreal to be home after months of living in a war zone. The simple sights and sounds, the bright lights, the chatter of travelers, the hum of announcements were a stark contrast to the harsh, unpredictable environment she'd left behind. Reaching the baggage carousel, Emma spotted her duffel bag and heaved it onto her shoulder. Her father immediately took it from her, insisting, "You've carried enough, Emma. Let me handle this." "Thanks, Dad," she said with a grateful smile, touched by his gesture. As they exited the terminal, the crisp Chicago air greeted her, carrying with it a sense of familiarity and peace. Emma paused for a moment, taking a deep breath and letting the reality of her return sink in. She was home. Truly home. Her mother's voice broke through her thoughts. "We have a surprise for you," she said, a mischievous smile on her face. Emma raised an eyebrow. "A surprise?" "You'll see," her father said, leading the way toward the parking lot. As they rounded a corner, Emma's eyes widened. In the back of their truck, a second banner was unfurled, along with more balloons and a tray of homemade cookies, her favorite. "We thought the first banner wasn't enough," her mother explained, laughing through her tears. Emma laughed, feeling a swell of love for her family. "You guys really went all out, didn't you?" "Of course," Tyler chimed in. "You deserve it." As they piled into the car, the questions continued, but Emma didn't mind. She relished every moment, every word. Her family's love and pride surrounded her like a cocoon, easing the weight she carried and reminding her of the support that had been waiting for her all along. As they drove home, Her father glanced at her through the rear-view mirror. "You doing okay, sweetheart?" Emma nodded, her gaze out the window at the familiar streets of her hometown. "Yeah, Dad, I think I am." Her mother turned in her seat, her eyes soft with concern and love. "Take your time adjusting, Emma. We're here for you, no matter what." "I know," Emma replied, her voice steady, "and that makes all the difference." They pulled into the driveway of their modest home, and Emma's eyes immediately went to the porch. A third banner, this one reading, "Welcome Home, Captain Roberts," hung proudly, surrounded by small American flags. Emma felt tears prick at her eyes as she stepped out of the car. Her family gathered around her, their excitement bubbling over as they ushered her inside. The smell of her mother's cooking filled the air, and the familiar warmth of her childhood home wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. For the first time in months, Emma felt a profound sense of peace. She was home, surrounded by love, and ready to begin this next chapter of her life. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she wouldn't face them alone. After dinner, as the family gathered in the living room, Emma Roberts leaned back on the couch, feeling the warmth of home surrounding her. Her mother handed her a steaming mug of tea, and her father sat across from her, a thoughtful look on his face. Tyler, uncharacteristically quiet, fiddled with his phone but kept stealing glances at her. Emma sensed that they had something on their minds. Finally, her father cleared his throat. "Emma, we've been talking about something, and we wanted to share it with you." Emma raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "What's up, Dad?" Her mother chimed in, her voice gentle but encouraging. "You know Mr. Johnson from down the street, right? He runs that security firm, Johnson Protective Services." Emma nodded. She vaguely remembered the man, a retired police officer who often waved when she passed by. "Yeah, I know him. What?" Her father smiled. "Well, he reached out to us a few weeks ago. He's been expanding his business and wants to hire veterans. He specifically asked about you. He said he'd be honored to have someone with your experience on his team." Emma blinked, taken aback. "Me? But I've just come home. I haven't even thought about work yet." Her mother leaned forward, her expression understanding. "We know, honey. We're not trying to pressure you. We just thought it might be a good opportunity, especially since he values what veterans bring to the table. He even mentioned flexible hours and support for transitioning back into civilian life." Emma glanced down at her mug, her thoughts swirling. The idea of a steady, local job with a veteran-friendly employer was appealing. After years of structured military life, the possibility of stability close to home sounded comforting. Yet, the idea of leaving behind the uniform and the sense of purpose it gave her felt daunting. "What kind of work would it be?" she asked, looking up at her father. "Security consulting, mainly," he replied. "Risk assessments, training programs, and some on-site management. It's not as intense as what you're used to, but Mr. Johnson said it's meaningful work." Tyler spoke up, his voice unusually serious. "I think it'd be cool if you stayed home for a while. You know, like for good." Emma smiled at him, touched by his honesty. "I missed you too, Squirt." But it's not that simple. Her mother reached over and placed a hand on hers. "Emma, we just want you to know that you have options. You've given so much to the military, and if you decide to stay, we'll support you. But if you want to explore a life here, we're here for that too." Emma nodded, her chest tightening with emotion. "Thanks, Mom. It's just a lot to think about. The military has been my whole life for years. It's not just a job, it's a mission, a purpose. Walking away from that feels strange." Her father's expression softened. "It's a big decision, Emma. No one's expecting you to figure it all out tonight. Mr. Johnson just wanted us to let you know the door's open if you're interested." Emma leaned back, sipping her tea and letting the conversation settle. She appreciated her family's understanding, but the weight of the decision loomed large. Her mind drifted back to her deployment, to the sense of camaraderie and purpose she felt with her unit. Could she find that same fulfillment in civilian life? Or would she always feel a pull to return to the military? "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'm not ready to decide yet, but I appreciate you telling me." Her mother smiled warmly. "That's all we ask, sweetheart. Take your time. You've earned it." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Emma couldn't shake the questions swirling in her mind. As her family laughed and reminisced, she realized that no matter what path she chose, she wouldn't be alone. Their love and support were constants, a foundation she could rely on as she navigated the uncertain road ahead. Later that evening, as Emma stood on the back porch gazing at the stars, she reflected on her options. Staying home offered stability, a chance to reconnect with her family and contribute to her community. But re-enlisting meant continuing the mission she'd dedicated herself to, the chance to make an impact in ways she deeply valued. The crisp night air cooled her face as she took a deep breath. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "No one's expecting you to figure it all out tonight." He was right. For now, it was enough to be home, to feel the love of her family, and to know that whatever decision she made, she had their unwavering support. As Emma turned to head back inside, a sense of peace washed over her. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she was certain of one thing. Her journey was far from over, and she had the strength to face whatever came next. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood, Emma Roberts sat on the porch of her family's home, enjoying the rare stillness. She sipped her tea, reflecting on the whirlwind of emotions since her return. The peace was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. She stood, curious, as a man stepped out. David, the man from the plane. Emma's brow furrowed slightly in surprise as he approached, holding a folder in his hand. "Captain Roberts," he began, his voice hesitant but sincere. "I hope I'm not intruding. I found your address on the envelope you gave me, and I wanted to thank you. Your letter, it really changed how I see things." Emma set her mug down, motioning for him to join her on the porch. "David," she said, her tone warm but curious. I didn't expect to see you again so soon. What brings you here?" He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if trying to find the right words. "Your letter, in the conversation we had afterward, it's been on my mind constantly. I realized how much anger and prejudice I've been carrying and how it's blinded me. I wanted to tell you in person how much I appreciate what you shared with me." Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I'm glad it resonated with you, David. It wasn't easy to write, but I hoped it might help bridge some of the gaps between us." David sat down, his hands gripping the folder tightly. "It did, more than you know, and it got me thinking about something. I run a veteran support group, small but growing. We help returning service members adjust to civilian life, providing resources and a place to share their stories. I think your voice, your perspective, could make a real difference there." Emma tilted her head, intrigued. "What kind of work are you doing with the group?" David opened the folder, pulling out a few papers. "We organize workshops, provide career counseling, and host events where veterans can share their experiences with the community. But what we're missing is someone who can speak to the deeper issues, things like overcoming prejudice, building bridges between civilian and military worlds, and finding purpose after service. After hearing your story, I think you could bring something unique to the group." Emma leaned back, considering his words. The idea was appealing, sharing her experiences in a way that could help others navigate the challenges she had faced. But it also felt daunting. "I'm honored you'd think of me, David, but I'm not sure I'm ready. I'm still figuring things out myself." David gave her a small, understanding smile. "That's exactly why you'd be perfect for it. You're in the thick of it just like so many of us. Your honesty and willingness to share your journey could be exactly what someone else needs to hear." Emma was silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling over her. She thought about the soldiers she had served with, the struggles they had shared, and the conversations they'd had about life beyond the military. She knew how isolating it could feel to transition back to civilian life, and how much support could mean in those moments. "Tell me more about the group," she said finally, her curiosity outweighing her hesitation. David's face lit up as he began to explain. "We meet weekly, sometimes in person, sometimes online. It's a mix of veterans from different branches and eras, all coming together to share and support one another. We also invite community members to some of our events to help bridge the gap between those who've served and those who haven't. It's been rewarding, but we need more voices, more people like you." Emma nodded slowly, imagining what it would be like to stand before a room of veterans and civilians, sharing her story and the lessons she had learned. The idea both excited and unnerved her. "It sounds like important work," she admitted. "But what if I don't have all the answers? What if I say the wrong thing?" David chuckled softly. "None of us have all the answers, Emma. What matters is your willingness to try, to open up and connect. You've already shown you can do that. Your letter to me proved it." Emma's lips curved into a small smile. "You really believe I can make a difference?" "I do," he said firmly, "and I think you'll find it rewarding too. It's not just about helping others, it's about finding your own path forward. Sharing your story can be a way to process everything you've been through, to give it meaning." Emma's gaze drifted out over the street, the familiar sights of her neighborhood grounding her as she thought about her future. She had been so focused on what she had left behind in the military that she hadn't fully considered what she could bring to the civilian world. "Okay," she said after a long pause, meeting David's eyes. "I'll give it a try. I can't promise I'll have all the answers, but I'll do my best." David smiled, genuine and relieved. "That's all anyone can ask for. Thank you, Emma. I think you'll find this experience just as meaningful as I know others will." As David stood to leave, Emma walked him to his car. "Thank you for coming," she said, "and for seeing something in me I wasn't sure was there." David turned back to her, his expression earnest. "It's there, Emma. You're a natural leader. I'll be in touch about our next meeting." As he drove away, Emma stood in the driveway, the papers he'd given her in hand. She felt a mix of apprehension and anticipation. Joining the support group wasn't just about helping others. It was a step toward redefining her own identity and finding a new mission and continuing to serve in a different way. Back on the porch, her mother peeked out the door. "Who was that, honey?" Emma smiled, tucking the papers into her bag. A new friend, and maybe the start of something important. Her mother nodded knowingly. "You always find a way to make a difference, Emma. It's who you are." Emma leaned against the porch railing, feeling a quiet sense of purpose settle over her. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it, one step at a time. The evening was quiet. The house settled in a calm stillness after a day of heartfelt conversations and warm reunions. Emma Roberts sat on the back porch, the familiar scent of her mother's garden mingling with the cool night air. She leaned against the railing, her thoughts swirling as she gazed at the stars. Her mother stepped outside, carrying a warm sweater. "You looked like you might need this," she said softly, wrapping the sweater around Emma's shoulders. Emma smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thanks, Mom," she said, pulling the sweater tighter around herself. Her mother settled into a chair nearby, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "You've been awfully quiet tonight," she said gently. "A penny for your thoughts?" Emma hesitated, her gaze still fixed on the sky. I've just been thinking about everything, she admitted. The flight, David, the letter I wrote, it's all been a lot to process. Her mother nodded, giving her the space to continue. Emma turned to face her, her voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. Mom, do you ever feel like the world is so divided that trying to fix it feels impossible? Her mother tilted her head thoughtfully. I think a lot of people feel that way, she said. But I've always believed that change starts small, with a conversation, a gesture, or even just listening to someone you don't understand. Emma let the words sink in, then sighed. I guess that's what I was trying to do with David. Writing that letter, it felt like the only way to address what happened without making things worse. But part of me wondered if it would even make a difference. Her mother leaned forward, her eyes warm with understanding. And yet, it did. You said he came here to thank you, didn't he? That's no small thing, Emma. Emma nodded slowly. He did, and it wasn't just gratitude. He admitted he'd been carrying anger and prejudice, and he's trying to work through it. That meant a lot to hear, but it also made me think about how many others might feel the same way, but don't have the chance to see things differently. Her mother reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her daughter's arm. You gave him that chance. By sharing your story, you helped him see beyond his assumptions. That's the power of dialogue, Emma. It doesn't solve everything, but it opens a door. Emma smiled faintly, looking down at her hands. It's just hard sometimes. In the military, things are clear-cut. You have a mission, a plan. Out here, it's messy. People don't always listen, and there's no guarantee they'll change. True, her mother agreed. But the messiness is part of life. Change takes time and patience, and sometimes the smallest ripple can grow into something much bigger. Emma let out a soft laugh. You always know how to make things sound hopeful, Mom. Her mother smiled warmly. That's my job, but Emma, you've always had a gift for connecting with people. Even as a child, you were the one who brought your friends together when they fought, who stood up for kids who didn't have a voice. That hasn't changed. It's just grown stronger. Emma leaned back, reflecting on her mother's words. She thought about the letter she'd written to David, about the courage it had taken to confront his prejudice with compassion instead of anger. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. The conversation they'd shared over coffee felt like a small victory, not just for her, but for what she believed in. You're right, Emma said finally. I think that's why I wrote the letter. I didn't want to add to the anger or the division. I just wanted to show him that there's another way to see the world. Her mother's eyes glistened with pride. And you did. That's what makes you special, Emma. You don't just see problems. You look for solutions. You build bridges. Emma chuckled softly, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Building bridges sounds so much easier in theory. Everything does, her mother replied with a grin. But you're doing it, one step at a time, and who knows, maybe that's your mission now, not just as a soldier, but as a person. Emma considered that, the idea settling over her like the sweater wrapped around her shoulders. She'd always thought of her mission as something tied to her uniform, her rank, and her duties. But maybe her mother was right. Maybe her mission was bigger than that, more personal. It wasn't about orders or assignments. It was about creating connections, fostering understanding, and challenging the barriers that kept people apart. I think you're onto something, Emma said, her voice thoughtful. Maybe this is a new kind of mission for me. Her mother smiled, her pride evident. Whatever you decide, Emma, just know that you don't have to do it alone. You have us, and you have the people who believe in you, like David. Emma nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Thanks, Mom, for everything. Her mother stood, leaning down to kiss her daughter's forehead. Anytime, sweetheart. Now, don't stay out here too long. It's getting cold." Emma watched her mother retreat into the house, the door closing softly behind her. She stayed on the porch a while longer, gazing at the stars and thinking about the challenges ahead. The road wouldn't be easy, but she felt ready to face it, one conversation, one connection, one bridge at a time. For the first time since her deployment, Emma felt a sense of clarity. She didn't have all the answers, but she didn't need to. What mattered was her willingness to try, to listen, and to lead with compassion. With that, she knew she could make a difference not just for herself, but for the world around her. Over the weeks that followed her return home, Emma Roberts found herself stepping into a role she hadn't expected. At first, it began with a small invitation from her old high school. The principal, hearing about her recent experiences, asked if she'd speak to the students about her time in the military and the lessons she'd learned. Though hesitant at first, Emma agreed, realizing it could be an opportunity to share her story in a meaningful way. Standing before a packed auditorium, Emma took a deep breath and began. She spoke about her time in Iraq, the challenges of deployment, and the bonds she'd formed with her unit, a group of people from every corner of the country, united by their commitment to service. She shared stories of courage, teamwork, and the moments that had shaped her understanding of humanity. But she didn't stop there. Emma also touched on the difficulties of returning home, the encounter with David on the plane, and the importance of bridging divides through empathy and understanding. Her message resonated. Students asked questions, some shy, others bold, about her experiences and the lessons they could apply to their own lives. Teachers approached her afterward, thanking her for her honesty and the impact her words had on the students. What she had thought would be a one-time event quickly became something more. Soon, other schools and community groups reached out, inviting her to speak. At every event, Emma tailored her message, weaving in personal anecdotes and reflections on the power of connection. She emphasized the importance of seeing beyond differences and working toward understanding. Whether she was speaking to teenagers, veterans, or local leaders, her core message remained the same. Empathy and dialogue could overcome even the deepest divides. Emma's talks inspired conversations that extended far beyond the events themselves. Students wrote essays about what they had learned. Community leaders discussed ways to promote inclusion, and veterans shared their own stories of transition and resilience. Emma's words became a catalyst for change, sparking new perspectives and fostering unity. For Emma, the experience was transformative. Each event reminded her of the strength in vulnerability and the power of storytelling to connect people. She no longer saw herself solely as a soldier, but as a bridge builder, someone who could inspire others to challenge their assumptions and embrace the humanity in those around them. It was a mission she felt deeply honored to carry forward. With each passing day, Emma Roberts grew more confident in her new role as a storyteller and advocate. Supported by her family's unwavering love and encouragement, she fully embraced her mission of fostering understanding and empathy. Her experiences on the battlefield and beyond had given her a unique perspective, and she now saw the power in using her voice to create change. Emma began to see herself not just as a veteran, but as a bridge builder, someone who could connect people from different walks of life through meaningful conversations. Whether she was speaking at a school assembly, attending a veteran support group, or addressing community leaders, her message remained clear. Compassion and understanding could overcome even the most entrenched divides. Her family's pride fueled her determination. They attended her talks, offered advice, and reminded her of the impact she was making. Her mother often said, "You've always had a gift for bringing people together," a sentiment Emma carried with her to every event. As Emma stood on a stage or sat in small discussion groups, she realized her work wasn't just about sharing her story. It was about listening to others, opening doors to dialogue, and helping people see the humanity in one another. It was a purpose she deeply cherished.